Well, this is a pleasant surprise. I was expecting to speak later in the order, but it seems some other senators who were listed in the speaking order have not been able to find their way to the chamber on time to take up their allotted spot in the speaking order, so I very happily step into the breach.
I do remind you, Senator Paterson, the speaking list is a guide only.
Yes, and a guide I think that we could— I'll take that interjection, Chair.
Well, it's not an interjection, it's just my advice to you.
Well, thank you for your advice. I'll take your advice, and it's a guide that which we can normally rely upon and which is normally a very good guide to what happens in the chamber. But this morning, perhaps for some other reason, senators who were scheduled to speak in the normal order have decided not to. As it happens, I was just sitting at my desk in my office writing the speech that I was due to deliver here on company taxes. But fortunately for me, this is an issue which we have all canvassed very widely in this chamber and over the last few months, so I'm sure I'll be able to make a contribution without it here in front of me. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to again make the case in this chamber for why Australia's company tax rate must be cut, why it must be reduced. There are many compelling reasons for this, which we will hear throughout this debate. But I want to take an opportunity to address some of the arguments that have been made so far in this debate that I find less compelling. One of them was made by Senator Whish-Wilson earlier in the chamber. He concluded his contribution to this debate by saying that what was lacking in this debate and what was lacking on the part of the government was courage, and that if only the government had more courage, it would have taken a different approach to company taxes. Instead of advocating for a reduction in company tax rates, as the government is, the government would seek to find more revenue from companies, to raise more revenue from companies, to raise higher tax revenue from companies in this country. Well, I would respond to Senator Whish-Wilson through you, Chair, by noting that there is nothing courageous at all, politically or otherwise, by bashing big business and saying you're going to take more revenue from them. In fact, it's the least courageous thing you can do in Australian politics. It's the easiest thing you can do in Australian politics, because what you are doing is you're appealing to the base political instincts and ignorance of some people in the community and some people who deliberately sought to whip up ignorance in the community by portraying big business as somehow evil, as somehow non-contributors to our society, as somehow evading their obligations to pay a fair amount of tax in this country. It's in fact very popular and very easy to make this argument, and that is what the Greens do, and I think it lacks political courage, in fact, to make these arguments. So I don't share Senator Whish-Wilson's view that the courageous thing to do would be to raise more revenue, and in fact the truth of it is that Senator Whish-Wilson and the Liberal Party and myself just bring a different philosophical approach to this issue. The Greens are in favour of big government. They think government knows best. They think more money here in Canberra would be a good thing. They think less money in the pockets of Australians, including Australian businesses, would be a good thing. And that's fair enough. We have a different philosophical worldview. They take their approach, we take ours. But let's not pretend that this is a question somehow of courage. It's almost a year ago that the Senate first passed the first part of the government's enterprise tax plan, and I want to congratulate and thank crossbench senators who at that time did the right thing by supporting tax cuts for small businesses up to $50 million in revenue. But now the crossbench has a different task, and that is to help the government finish the job, to legislate the rest of the enterprise tax plan. The case for finishing the job of the enterprise tax plan and passing the rest of the tax cuts is even stronger now than it was 12 months ago. All of the same arguments made then about stimulating increased investment and the flow-on benefits that would accrue to employment and wages, of course, remain exactly the same. But today there are two significant additional arguments that I hope crossbench senators in particular carefully consider. I want to thank them for so far engaging constructively with the government on these issues. In my view, it's to the great credit of Senators Leyonhjelm, Anning and Bernardi that they have already agreed to support the government's full package. It's also a credit to the One Nation senators, as well as Senator Hinch and our new colleague from South Australia, Senator Storer, that they remain open-minded and that they are willing to negotiate. But coming back to these two new pieces of evidence that we have now that we didn't have 12 months ago, I wrote an article for the Financial Review earlier this month remarking on one of these, which is that if the Senate stops now, if the Parliament stops now and leaves only in place the tax cuts legislated for small business, rather than finishing the job and legislating the rest of the tax cuts for all other businesses, then what we will be inadvertently perhaps doing is leaving in place an inefficient and distorting two-tiered company tax system. It will put in place a series of perverse incentives, and it will vastly limit the benefits of the tax cut passage. Now, I understand the political dynamic here. It is much easier to be seen to be supporting tax cuts for small business, after all, who hates small business. Not even the Greens, I believe, hate small business. But a different tax rate for larger businesses would effectively create a discriminatory company tax system that will punish businesses for their success. It's not what we should be doing. We should be instead encouraging businesses to grow. It is a very good thing when a small business becomes a large business. A two-tiered company tax system will do the opposite. It will hit companies with a 5% tax increase as soon as they pass a turnover of $50 million, regardless of how profitable they may be. It will discourage innovation and create a perverse incentive for companies on the margin to limit their growth or to artificially structure their affairs to avoid crossing this threshold and paying more tax. It will inevitably impact business investment, economic growth and job creation. A two-tiered company tax system will seriously dampen the benefits that we could otherwise count on from cutting Australia's company tax rate. The truth is that the biggest bang for buck in economic terms will come from lowering taxes on our largest businesses. Saul Lestlake, an economist, has noted that the greatest growth in private sector employment in recent years has in fact come from big companies. If we want to see more of some of the 403,000 record jobs created in the last 12 months, it is not going to come by penalising big business. I doubt that any of those 400,000 people, many of whom got jobs in large businesses in the last year, want their employer to be penalised for their success. ABS surveys on innovation also show that large businesses are the most likely to adopt new and innovative practices. Despite all of the propaganda that you hear about corporate tax avoidance, the reality is that it is big business that pays the overwhelming share of company tax in this country. That means that it's big business who is most likely to respond to the incentive provided by a reduction in the company tax rate. These are the facts. According to the latest figures from the Australian Taxation Office, Australia's 2,475 biggest companies, that is the top 0.2% of companies, pay almost 64% of all company tax in Australia. The 64% of company tax in Australia are paid by a tiny proportion, the top tiny proportion of Australia's largest businesses. They are paying their fair share. The Labor Party has also been running an inherently contradictory argument here. They say on the one hand that big business pays no tax or avoids paying the right rate of tax, and therefore we shouldn't cut their rate of tax. But if a business doesn't pay any tax, then how would it benefit from a reduction in the rate of tax? If they pay $0 of tax at 30% because they make no net profit, then they will still pay $0 of tax when that rate is reduced to 25%. It's the companies who already pay billions of tax that will benefit from a lower tax rate and who will respond to a lower tax rate with increased investment. The international capital flows that a lower corporate tax rate is designed to attract overwhelmingly goes to big business. If we want to attract more of that investment, we need to ensure that the return on that investment is competitive. It won't be if we continue to fall behind our competitors by having a higher corporate tax rate. $1 of profit in a jurisdiction with a 25% corporate tax rate is much more attractive for an investor than $1 of profit in a jurisdiction with a 30% tax rate. Now, economists disagree about the exact share of where the company tax burden falls. Is it on shareholders through lower returns? Is it on employees through lower wages? Or is it on customers through higher prices? They disagree about the proportion of the burden that falls on those three groups. But they all agree that it's a shared burden. All of those three groups bear the burden of company taxes. And it's a burden which is ultimately borne by people. Ultimately, the cost of company taxes is paid by individuals, And it doesn't matter whether they are customers, whether they are employees or whether they are shareholders, they all ultimately pay company taxes. And I think the shareholders, employees and customers of large businesses are no less deserving of being relieved of that burden than small businesses. We all interact with large businesses every single day. Ironically, it was perhaps opposition leader Bill Shorten who has made the most cogent argument against a two-tiered company tax system. When he was the Assistant Treasurer in 2011, he said, and I quote, "Lowering the corporate rate for smaller businesses only, as the Greens propose, creates an artificial incentive for Australian businesses to downsize. In worst-case scenarios, some businesses might actually lay people off to get smaller, and the size-based different tax treatment would create a glass ceiling on business workforce growth. Instead, we want a level playing field regardless of the size of the company." Now, Senator Whish-Wilson objects, but I encourage him to take up his objection with the opposition leader Bill Shorten, because I'm only quoting his words. In his view, a differential tax rate between large and small companies could lead to businesses laying off workers, and I don't think that's what we want to see. I think Bill Shorten was right in 2011 when he said we want to see a level playing field regardless of the size of the company. Now, leaving in place a differential rate of company tax also runs the risk that the company tax system will become even more progressive over time. I'm sure that's in fact exactly what the Greens would propose. We could see in this country more thresholds and higher rates imposed on larger businesses to resemble the personal income tax system. Now, this would even further compound the inefficiencies that we already may see from this differential rate. And it is not hard, sadly, to foresee a future government succumbing to this economic populism, but the truth is that we would all be poorer for it. Now, clearly, there is only one way to fix this dilemma. Unless the Senate crossbench and those opposite propose to vote for increasing taxes on small business, and one would hope no one in their right mind would propose doing that, then the only other alternative, if we want to see a level playing field, if we want to see a consistent tax system, is to help the government finish what it started and pass the rest of the company tax cuts. I mentioned at the beginning of my speech that there were two new pieces of information that we have today that we did not have 12 months ago. The second new piece of information that we have today is, of course, the success in the United States of President Trump's sweeping tax reforms, which in December passed the US Congress. It lowered the US corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%, plus a range of other cuts to US taxes to make the system more competitive. Now, in previous debates, I and other senators have talked about the remarkable investments that these changes have encouraged. I've read out the names of dozens and dozens and dozens of companies who have increased the wages of their employees, who have announced new investments in their domestic businesses, or who will be delivering higher returns to their shareholders as a result of the passage of the Trump tax cuts. Now, I won't do that again today because we already all know about the positive impact the tax cuts have had on the US economy. I should point out that that's an economy which already has a lower unemployment rate than Australia and a stock market at near record highs. That is before the effects of these tax cuts. But what I do want to talk about is, in fact, the negative impact that the Trump tax cuts could have on the Australian economy. It sounds strange to think that another country reducing their taxes could in some way harm Australia, but the truth is that it will if we fail to respond. Australia has relied on foreign investment since the First Fleet, and we remain dependent on it today. It has massively enriched our country over 200 years, and if we continue to attract it, it will continue to do so. Australia would be unimaginable without the foreign investment that we have enjoyed in that time. But there is not a limitless amount of international capital available for that foreign investment here in Australia. It's scarce. There is no guarantee that that investment will come here to Australia. If the returns are better in other countries, then that is where the investment will go. We can't force people to come and invest here in Australia. Now, America is not just a competitor nation in that fight for scarce international capital. It is our #1 source of foreign investment. In 2016, Americans invested $860 million in Australia, or 27% of our total foreign investment. But in 2016, when an American investor was contemplating investing either at home in the US or abroad in Australia, what they faced was a comparative tax rate in the US of 35% and 30% in Australia. So it made quite good sense for an American investor contemplating an investment between those two countries, assuming that the investment was the same, to make that investment in Australia. That investor was going to get a better return on investment only due to the fact that the Australian company tax rate was 5% lower at that time than the United States. But that same investor making that same decision today faces a very different playing field. That investor is contemplating a 21% corporate tax rate at home in the United States or a 30% tax rate here in Australia. Now, what would you do if you were that investor, particularly if you wanted to invest in a large business in Australia that still faces a 30% tax rate? Would you invest at home, where it's probably, to be clear, going to be more straightforward and simple and easy to do, and has a lower corporate tax rate? Or would you invest abroad, overseas, in Australia, where you're going to face a higher tax rate? If the investments were comparable, then of course you would invest at home. It's simpler, it's easier, and you get a better return on investment. The only way that you would continue to choose to invest in Australia with our higher corporate tax rate is if the returns in Australia were so much better that they are enough to compensate for that much higher corporate tax rate. I hope that's the case. I hope that returns in Australia are always so generous and so strong that investors choose to disregard our higher corporate tax rate and invest in here anyway. Or perhaps sentiment will rule the day and they really like our weather or our cuisine and they choose to invest here. But I think the reality is, I think all of us can acknowledge, the truth is that that won't continue to happen. We will have investment returns comparable to any other nation, and if we have a tax rate higher than most other nations, then that investment will start to dry up, and it will dry up from the United States, our largest source of foreign investment. Of course, as we know, the United States is not the only country in the world cutting their corporate tax rate. Our second biggest foreign investor is the United Kingdom. In 2016, they invested $515 million, or 16% of our total foreign investment. Today, the UK corporate tax rate is now 19%. They've been cutting their corporate tax rate for a decade. Back in 2010, it was comparable to Australia's at 28%. Incidentally, in their corporate tax reform in the UK, they didn't just reduce the rates of tax paid for all their businesses, they abolished the previous differential rate that they used to have for small business, because they recognise, as Bill Shorten does, that it's inefficient to have two different rates of tax depending on the size of the business. So they, in fact, in lowering their corporate tax rate overall, abolished their separate tax rate, their different tax rate for small businesses. Now they just have one tax rate of 19%, significantly lower than Australia's, and it's forecast to continue to fall. Now, nations across the world are following suit. Corporate tax rates are continuing to come down. According to the Tax Foundation in Washington, D.C., in 2017, the average global corporate tax rate was just 22.96%, a full 7 percentage points lower than Australia. In the OECD, we are now among a handful of the highest corporate taxing nations, in the handful of top corporate taxing nations in the OECD. And to be honest, let's be clear, the OECD is really a club of high taxing nations, so it is a particularly bad statistic to be a high taxing nation within a club of high taxing nations. But that's the truth. Australia is becoming increasingly out of step with the rest of the world. Our corporate tax rate is higher than the rest of the world now, and it will only get higher still if we refuse to act. It will be inefficient for us to leave in place a differential rate between our small businesses and our large businesses. We are falling behind the rest of the world. If we don't act, we will pay for this. If we don't act, we will all regret this day, this week, where the Senate decided not to support this tax passage. I hope that the Crossbench continue their productive conversations with the government. I hope they continue to show an open mind about this plan. And I can even hope, perhaps for a miracle through you, Chair, that those opposite will come to their senses, that they'll revert back to the view that they used to hold only a few years ago, that I suspect their opposition leader, Mr Shorten, still deep down holds, but perhaps doesn't have the confidence to argue within his caucus. But perhaps a miracle will happen and they will return to the view that they all held back in 2011. And as Senator Smith says, magic does happen, and perhaps we'll see it here in the Senate this week.